want to talk today about the American Revolution. And on Wednesday, we'll move on to the French Revolution. Up until now, we've been doing a lot of talking about the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and those guys are known for having done a lot of talking. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, John Locke, Adam Smith, Beccaria, Rousseau, Voltaire. All these guys are known for what they said, and most importantly, what they wrote down. All of them left with us their ideas in pamphlets, letters, and books about how to improve the condition of life on this planet for humans right now. Now, one of the most important of those people is John Locke. What is the one thing that you remember when you think of John Locke? What's the one thing that stands out for you? Natural rights. Life, liberty, and the enjoyment of your property. And government is created to do what? To protect those rights. So if government is created to protect your natural rights, it doesn't give you your rights. What are you entitled to do if government threatens your natural rights? What's that? Retaliate, rebel, overthrow your government, right? We also looked at Voltaire, who talked about religious toleration, letting everybody practice their faith without trying to force them into doing so, separation of church and state, an idea John Locke also gave us. Let me stop with those two big ones. When you write about everybody has natural rights, that government belongs to the people, government is a servant of the people, how does monarchy fit into that way of thinking? How do you reconcile monarchy with the idea that people have the right to choose their own government? How do you put those two together? Can you put them together? Do you choose kings? Do you vote for a king? No. The king inherits his title from his father and his father before him. And yet at this time, John Locke is talking about the people have a right to representative government. The point is, if you write this stuff down, the people deserve a government that they have chosen. The people have all natural rights. The people are all equal. They're going to believe it. And when the government starts taking away those rights, they're going to feel they have an actual legitimate right to rebel. So then all of a sudden we go from the theory of John Locke and Rousseau and all those guys that talked about equality and the people and all that stuff, to the reality of, I don't like this government. I have a right to rebel. People have a right to rebel, but governments are going to push back. And they're the ones with the guns, mostly. So now you have a bloody revolution, and you're putting ideas into practice, and that's where things get a little messy. And that's the American Revolution. And the French. The American Revolution starts off in 1776. The French begins in 1789. Both have as their basic foundation that they took the readings of the Enlightenment to heart. They believed it, and they felt that this is the way to organize their society. Both of them believed in the writings of John Locke, natural rights, equality, representative government, separation of church and state, all that stuff. But all of them, the French, the American Revolutions, their fundamental unifying concept is the people have a right to be free from oppression. Whether it's from churches or governments or whatever, the people have a right to be free of oppression. From that basic idea, anything is possible. And that's what happens in these revolutions. So how does the American Revolution happen? I want you to think about this for a moment. Is anyone familiar with Great Britain, England, etc.? Ever visited there? Ever watched a TV show produced in England or anything? Ever heard an English actor on TV or anything? Are you familiar with the English accent? Yes. So we have a common language, right? And the original American colonists came from Britain, England, Britain. In this case, I'm using them interchangeably. And they brought with them the Christian religion. They brought with them the English Bill of Rights. They brought with them a belief in capitalism. And they brought with them a loyalty to the English king. Americans, up until the American Revolution of 1776, believed themselves to be loyal members of the British Empire, loyal subjects of the King of England, and many of them considered themselves to be transplanted Englishmen and Englishwomen, no longer living back in Europe, but living here in America, but all with the same rights, languages, beliefs, and customs. You follow? But then all of a sudden in 1776, there's a Declaration of Independence that says, as much as we have in common, we no longer feel it is beneficial to live within this empire, and we need independence. How did this happen? Slowly. Slowly but surely, where you start off with misunderstandings, frustrations, lack of trust, eventually bloodshed, and then no turning back. And it starts like this. At the end of the 7 Years' War, which formed part of a much larger French and Indian War, which took place in North America, the British had defeated its major enemies, the Spanish and the French Empire. They had completely destroyed the French Empire in North America, taking over all of its territory, and also taking territory away from Spain. Florida, to be exact. Now, with this crushing victory, the British were now in complete control of the entire eastern half of what we now know today as the United States and all of Canada. It was an amazing victory, but it was expensive because it was a world war. At the end of which, the British decided they needed to raise money in a way that they had never done before because the debt was so high. So the British Parliament back in London started passing specific laws to collect money from the American colonists themselves. And this had never happened before. The Sugar Act was, comparatively speaking, a very minor law. This act said it is illegal for Americans to smuggle sugar-based products. Now, Americans have been, because the idea is all trade must happen within the British Empire and must be regulated so that customs can be collected. Now, Americans have been smuggling all types of things for years. They've been arrested, they've been put on trial, but usually American judges and juries give them a light sentence because they don't believe that it should be criminal, that you could trade outside of the British Empire. The Sugar Act changes that and says, if you are now caught, you are no longer in front of an American judge and jury, you're in front of a British military judge and jury, or basically judge, who always gives out harsh sentences. So this is putting an existing law into effect, which people take perhaps some problem with. But then they move on, because this is not collecting enough money. Making sure that you collect the duty on sugar does not raise enough money for the British. So they passed the Stamp Act in 1765. This is the act that really frustrates everybody because everybody has to pay it, rich and poor. And in a nutshell, it just says if there's any type of paper produced in the New World, it has to have an official stamp on it, and the money from that tax does not go to Americans and American holdings. It goes to the British to pay off their debt. At this point, you have the beginnings of a problem, and this is the shift in the colonies that I talked about. The British, the purple, before the end of the Spanish, the 7 Years' War, the British afterwards. Complete domination. Now, the reason why there's a big difference here is because the British honestly believed that the British King and the British Parliament represents the interests of all Englishmen everywhere, all over the world, whether they settled in America, Canada, Australia, India. Their interests are represented and discussed by the British Parliament and the British King. The problem is, the Americans had a different view of representative government. Sorry? Absolutely. For the British, they believed, we are taking your views into account when we make laws like the stamp tax, because we know it's good for you to have a strong British Empire, whether you like it or not. The Americans, who also believe in representative government, have become used to electing their own government and collecting their own taxes. The Americans have gotten used to this, salutary neglect, where the British do not bother them with day-to-day requests. And that's the way the British have wanted it for about 170 years. They wanted the Americans to elect their own governments, build their own bridges and schools, collect their own taxes, defend themselves against Native Americans or whatever the case may be. But within the British Empire, to be the great customers they are of British-made goods. It was the perfect deal for the British. They spent little money on their empire in America, but they had the Americans as these great customers for stuff made in British factories. You follow me so far? But now they're changing the rules. Now they're actually imposing laws directly on the Americans, and the Americans are saying, you, Britain, taught us that the people have a right to representation. What you're doing is taxation without representation. You taught us a basic principle which you now are forgetting. And a lot of this comes from the English Bill of Rights, which you read for me. This notion that government cannot simply do what it wants. The people have some basic rights. But here's the difference. In the English Bill of Rights, it was Parliament's rights as representative of the people that were being written out. You have the freedom of speech in Parliament. You have the right to arm yourself as a member of Parliament to protect your freedom to criticize the king if you need be. The Americans took this basic understanding and said, everybody has a basic freedom of speech. Everybody has a right to protect themselves from any government oppression. And this is what it felt like the Americans were facing. And they were also being subjected to ideas, Republican ideas, in the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, you've had all this talk about equality, about freedom, about natural rights, about you can choose your own government. If you believe in all this stuff, there is no role for monarchy in that system of thinking. And so if you take kings out of a government, you end up with this, a republic, which is what America is now, a republic, no king. Every system of government is chosen by the American people, every level of government, excuse me. Because the belief is all monarchies are corrupt because they're not elected, they don't answer to the people. Other reasons why the Americans were so upset with the stamp tax is they couldn't afford it. Politically, they didn't want to pay it. On principle, they felt this was a violation of their basic political rights. But economically, the Americans were also feeling the tough times at the end of the war. The British said, we're out of money, we need you to help us pay down our debt. But the Americans' response was, the war is over, all the British soldiers have gone home, now we're going through a recession, an economic downturn. We don't have any money to pay an extra brand new tax. What makes you think we have this extra money? So they don't want to pay it either. The frustration of the Americans at the stamp tax that isn't localized in one city or one town. It slowly starts to spread across the 13 American colonies. And people like the Sons of Liberty, voluntary groups that speak up and proclaim that they are being Americans, their rights are being trampled upon. They are speaking amongst the people, they are rallying the people. At this point, the resistance to the British, it's not just the political leaders. It's the people on the ground that are being taught, you have basic rights, and Britain is taking it away. And this is what I want you to focus on for a moment. In order to make a revolution, you need leaders. Leaders are the ones that tell you why you're upset and how to beat your enemy. But you also need soldiers. You need people who fight. You have to convince the people it is in their interest to take on this fight, and if possible, not possible, if needed, to die for whatever cause it is. The problem is, if you motivate the people with claims of equality, that all people are equal, that all people have a right to representative government, that all people have the right to rebel against a government that is unfair or they perceive it to be unfair, well, what happens when these people don't have equality? They don't have the vote because they don't make enough money. They're going to start demanding that from their very leaders, their revolutionary leaders. So it gets a little dicey. But to make this thing work, you need it. And Sam Adams, the legendary brewer of Boston, was one of the earliest of these leaders. So the resistance to the stamp tax, the only way it could work was economic. There was no desire for independence. There was no desire for war. The British passed the tax because they wanted to raise money. So the Americans said, we will punish you in the only way we know how. We will stop buying your products. We are going to stop being your best customers. This was incredibly effective. And it was easy for the Americans because it was an economic downturn. So instead of buying foreign products, American merchants could simply sell stuff that was already in their warehouse to their customers. Now, this idea was developed at what's known as Stamp Act Congress, and it's at this place that the first hints of an American identity come out. Because up until now, the Americans and the British had a lot of stuff in common. But now the Americans have something in common that they don't have in common with the British, and that is they have Britain as an enemy. All of them are upset with the stamp tax, and this binds them together. They now have a common interest, which makes them different from Britain. Britain folds. They cannot handle, during their tough economic times, Americans not buying British-made goods. So they cancel it. But they're still bankrupt. They still got to raise money. So they pass a couple of other acts which raise the tension and don't actually solve any problems. They just make things worse. The Quartering Act of 1766 gave Britain the right to place their soldiers in people's homes in order to enforce the collection of taxes. This is already starting to feel like the British are occupying America like a foreign country and not as a member of the British Empire. The Townsend Acts are passed in 1767. These are meant to raise money in a different way than the Stamp Act. Meaning, the Stamp Act, the Americans disliked because it was direct taxation of the Americans and they didn't vote for it. So the British response was, we regulate the economy. We regulate trade in the British Empire. You can't complain about that. In fact, you do very well economically by trading within the British Empire. This is just a new rule about customs that we will collect on certain products which are imported into America. The thing is, though, at this point, the Americans don't trust the British. They don't like anything that leads to the British taking money out of their pocket without their direct consent. And the Americans didn't vote for this. So they say no. Again, they turn to the boycott of British goods. The result is this, the Boston Massacre. You have British troops on the ground to enforce a tax or customs duties that the Americans don't want to pay. You have Americans who increasingly feel anything the British ask is illegal, and they are increasingly upset and resisting. Eventually, you get these two tensions. They come together. On March 1770 in Boston, you have civilians protesting against soldiers who are enforcing the collection of these taxes. Somebody gets nervous, soldiers open fire, civilians go down, you have a bit of a riot. It is written up in the press as the Boston Massacre. Soldiers are massacring innocent civilians to collect an illegal and unfair tax that the Americans have not consented to. John Adams, the first vice president and the second president of the United States, represented the British soldiers who opened fire, not because he loved Britain, but because he believed in America we're a government of laws, a society of laws. Everybody gets their day in court, even my enemy. It was this commitment to principle which made John Adams such a fervent independence fighter when he finally decided we can't live in the British Empire. They don't believe any of the principles they taught us. This is the way the Boston Massacre was drawn up in the newspapers and published. This is a fiction. There wasn't this type of quote-unquote massacre. It was a few casualties, and it wasn't this organized where you have soldiers lining up, taking aim and firing on innocent civilians. But that's the way it got drawn up because that was the way to sell papers, and that was the way to convince all Americans that the British are an enemy that need to be dealt with. And then the British come back and they pass a new tax to raise more money because they're still broke. The Townsend duties that I talked about a moment ago, one of them said the British government is empowered to collect customs duties on a variety of products. One of them is tea. Now, you may consider tea to be an odd thing to collect a customs duty on, but at the time, tea was an incredibly popular beverage. So if you put a custom on tea, it will raise a significant amount of money, especially if the only tea which is allowed to be sold in America is brought in by the East India Company, which happens to be allied to the British government. For the Americans, they're looking at this and thinking, you're saying only one company can bring the most popular beverage to America, and when they unload that tea on American shores, the British are empowered to collect a customs duty on it, which does not go to American banks and coffers, it goes to British sources. How is this any different than the stamp tax, where you are taking money from us without us voting for it, or the Townsend duties? How is this any different? How is this any different than taxation without representation, which is what we've been complaining about for the past 10 years? So, on December 16, 1773, when one of the first ships from the British East India Company comes to Boston to unload this tea, Bostonians, dressed as Native Americans, load the ship and dump the tea into the water, thus destroying a lot of British property. Now, Britain is an island. The only way they survive is if they are able to protect their trade around the world, right? If the Americans are now interfering with trade in Boston, what's to stop people living in other parts of the British Empire, Jamaica, West Africa, not South Africa yet, India? What's to stop those people from interfering with British trade in those parts of the empire? And the answer is nothing. So the British feel they have to make an example, because if they let the Bostonians or the Americans get away with this, the British Empire will crumble. And so they pass what's known as the Intolerable Acts, which are purposely meant to punish Boston so severely that nobody else in the American colonies will copy what the Bostonians do. They close their port and cut off all trade to the city of Boston, punishing it economically. They suspend the government. The British take over the government of the city of Boston, the colony of Massachusetts. And to enforce these rules and these taxes, British troops are actually now in the homes of Bostonians. So think about this for a moment. If you lived in Boston in 1774, you now had soldiers living in your home for whom you had to cook, you had to do their laundry, you had to clean their rooms, and their sole purpose was to occupy the city you lived in, to force you to pay a tax that you never voted for and you think is simply thievery, and it's completely illegal and illegitimate, and it's being done so at the point of a gun. Soldiers living in your home with your family. Which takes us to revolution. At this point, you have the breaking point. There are way too many people that are so fed up with Britain that they're just tired of talking. They get together at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, representatives from the colonies, just like they got together at the Stamp Act Congress, and they say, what are we going to do? Well, what have we always done? We boycott British goods. We don't buy stuff from Britain. We punish them economically. It's worked before, it'll work again. So we do that. The problem is, the British aren't caving in this time. They caved in after the stamp tax was passed, they got rid of it. They issued the Townsend duties, the Americans got upset, they got rid of most of them. When they tried to collect the duty on tea, the Americans destroyed the property. Now the British feel they got to take a stand, they have to make an example. They can't back down. If they back down, they'll lose authority across the world. Because remember, you have to think of this like a relationship between a child and their parent. Britain is acting like the parent. If I let this child talk back and get away with what they want, what happens to the rest of my kids? What authority do I have left over this family? That's essentially the mindset of the British king and the British Parliament at this time. So I got to make an example of the one that's causing the most trouble. Now, the Americans over the year of 1774 to 75 try to engage with the British king and say, you've gone too far. Yes, Boston should not have destroyed the property, but you can't shut down an entire city and take over their economy because it's freaking everybody out. If you can do it in Boston, you can do it anywhere else. And I'm telling you, the American people are scared out of their mind. You've got to pull back. Let's get back to the negotiating table and figure out a way where everybody's happy. The British king says, basically, forget it. I'm done talking. Tensions rise. The Americans recognize war is coming. They start preparing. They start collecting weaponry. They start hiding this weaponry from the British. The British get wind that there are secret stashes of weaponry that the Americans are collecting outside of Boston. Boston, the place where the biggest trouble has been caused for the British. The British troops march out to find these weapons. The Boston militia and other American volunteers that have shown up realize the troops are coming for their weapons. They arm themselves. They give battle at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. And this is basically the first blood spilt between forces of the American Continental Congress versus the British Empire. America has not declared its independence yet, but blood has been shed in this war, which eventually will be for independence. After this, the Continental Congress, in their second meeting, realizes we're not ready to declare independence, but we need to protect ourselves. We need a professional army, not a bunch of volunteer soldiers, which is what militia is. We need a professional army led by a professional, trained, experienced soldier. Who do we got? We got George Washington of Virginia. And he's got two things going for him. He's from the South, which means now the Southerners will be united with the Northerners, Boston, in this common struggle. Second, he's got years of actual on-the-ground military experience leading large groups of men. And that's what's needed now. So think about this for a moment. Before there was an America, a United States of America, there was a national army, a continental army. But still no independence. Why? Because independence is hard. Again, let me go back to that family analogy. All children have argued with their parents. All children have argued with their parents. All children have argued with their parents. Few children cut their parents out of their life permanently and forever because the fighting is so bad. Few people come to that point. Why? Well, because it's hard to do when you've lived with these people all your life and their family. So this is the same thing. For the Americans, this was, how do we declare our independence from the people that we got everything from? Language, religion, political systems, everything. How do we do that? Tom Paine came along in January of 1776 and showed them how to do it. His book, Common Sense, the reason it's called Common Sense is because he was trying to show that independence is not as hard as you think it is. In fact, it's the only thing that makes any sense right now. And he went through some basics, and here are the basics. America has got more land, more resources than Britain. It is economically able to be independent, to live on its own without being part of the British Empire. So we don't need to be a member of the British Empire to survive, A. B, America is a democracy. People here vote, white men, vote for their government. Local government, colonial government, etc. In Britain, they say they have representative government because they have British Parliament. But only 10% of the people in Britain vote for British Parliament. It's not that democratic. It's democratic in theory, but in America, it's more of a reality. There is never going to be a way that we're going to make peace with Britain. We're just two fundamentally different people. Same language, same religion, same economic system, but we really do have a different political system. They say that they represent the people with their British Parliament, but in America, we have real democracy, at least at the time, the standards of the time. You cannot deal with Britain. We have two separate fundamental political systems, fundamentally different political systems. So independence is the way to go. So on the 4th of July, 1776, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, along with a couple of other people like John Adams, after they wrote up the Declaration of Independence, it was voted on by the Second Continental Congress, and this document that begins with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, is the founding words of the American Republic, a government without a king, born of equality. Now, it has been pointed out by many other people that Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. And how could he write down, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, when he himself was a slaveholder? And in addition to that, in addition to being a slaveholder, he also had families with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Now, there's a variety of ways of answering this question. There were people at the time who believed that slavery was a necessary evil that would slowly fade away from America once the use of slaves was no longer needed. Some. Then there was a whole lot of other people that just never considered anything but white men to be the most important members of society, and so equality meant white men. I don't know for a fact what was in Jefferson's mind, but I do know that if you write down a document, if you write down in a document that all men are created equal, born with natural rights, that government exists with the consent of the people, and you write very broadly, people are going to take you seriously. At that time, there was a lot of people who didn't have the vote. Poor white men, for instance. But they fought the American Revolution for independence based on the idea that they deserved the vote. And what happened? Well, after the war was over, they demanded from their government, you told me to fight on behalf of equality, where's my vote? They got the vote. Catholics who fought in the American Revolutionary War and were still limited in the practice of their faith or in the government positions they can hold, after the war they said, you said we were fighting for equality. I'm tired of being punished for being a Catholic in a Protestant nation. So now we have religious toleration. And as the years went by, every single group of people that didn't feel that they had equality went back to the Declaration of Independence and said, if you said the government, this country, was based on equality, then why do we still have slavery? Why can't women have the right to vote? Etc., etc., etc. Everything in this country goes back to the Declaration of Independence written by a slaveholder. So what I need you to do is differentiate between the intent of the writer and the legacy or the influence of the work and how people choose to use it. Let me fast forward, because I'm getting tired, as I'm sure you are. We win the war. Surprise. We win. And the reason we win is because we had help. We beat the British in the American War of Independence, just like the Vietnamese beat America in the Vietnam War. The British had more money, more powerful navy, better army, but we knew the homeland. And, just like the Vietnamese, George Washington recognized 200 years earlier, as long as you keep an army in the field, then this rebellion survives. You don't have to win any battles, you just have to keep an army in the field, and the revolution continues. Slowly but surely you build up your victories, a little one here, a little one there, and then you start convincing foreigners, in this case, where is it, France and Spain, that this little American revolution is not going anywhere. And the French and the Spanish are ruled by absolute monarchies. They don't love democracy. They're afraid of democracy. They hate democracy. But they hate the British even more. Because remember, the British beat Spain and France in the 7 Years' War. And now the Americans are fighting successfully against the British, and the French and the Spanish decide, time to jump in. And so we win. What I want to leave you with now, because I'm getting tired, is, and I'll quickly go through this now and then I'll recap it with you at the next class. The problems of this new government. We have independence. Wonderful. So then what's wrong? We were so afraid of the strong government that we had just freed ourselves from. We had defeated the British king, the British parliament, the British army, who tried to take away our rights. We were so paranoid that if we created another strong national government in America, we'd have to go down through another path of revolution again. So, at the beginning of this country, as an independent nation, we had no president. Because we were afraid of giving one man that much power. We had a national Congress, the Continental Congress, but they weren't allowed to collect taxes on the American people directly. You know how now you you pay city, state, and federal taxes, right? The city government, the state government, and the national government are all empowered to tax you, take money directly out of your paycheck. Back then, the federal government, the government of the United States of America, had no right to tax you directly. They had to ask the states, will you please collect some money and send it to us at the capital, which at this point was New York City. I think it was New York City. And because we need help paying off the army, to paying off our debts. In addition to that, the American government didn't have the right to regulate its economy. It couldn't collect customs duties on imports and exports. If a government can't collect taxes and a government can't collect customs duties, a government can't raise money. And it's broke. It has no army. It has no civil service. It has no means of protecting itself, its people, and expanding its economy. So, the Constitution we live with today is a consequence of that weakness. The Americans got together and they said, we need a stronger government, and we have to get over this fear of strong national government. We need an executive, like a king, but elected by the people. We need a national Congress that can tax the people. We need a national Supreme Court that acts as part of the checks and balances system. Because we don't want to have national power concentrated in one person. We want the checks and the balances system. And the result is the Constitution. What we have today. And most importantly, the U.S. Bill of Rights. Because when you create a strong national government, at this time, there was two sides to this fight. Oops. Hang on. This is the last thing I want to give you. So, yeah. There are two sides to this fight. The Federalists who wanted a strong national government and the current Constitution we live under, and the Anti-Federalists who were afraid a stronger government would lead to corruption and the rights of the people eventually being taken away, just like the British king did. In order to get enough people to vote for this Constitution we live under now, the enemies of this Constitution had to be promised something. The Bill of Rights. They were told, accept the Constitution that you have now, that we live under now, that specifically states what the role of the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court is, and establishes a strong national government. But we're also going to give you a Bill of Rights. 10 specific things of the rights that this new, stronger government cannot take away from you by law. We are putting into practice what you already believe in. And with that little proviso, Americans voted for and approved the new Constitution, and then eventually the first 10 amendments, which is the U.S. Bill of Rights. And when you read the U.S. Bill of Rights, and then you compare them to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, you will see put into practice all the ideas that Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, Beccaria, all those guys were talking about in the abstract as, I think maybe we should have a society that works like this. You will see them in law in the U.S. Bill of Rights and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Ideas turned into practice. So think about that when you're reading these documents for Wednesday. Think about what's similar in these documents. Isolate what's different, and think to yourself, why do the Americans believe this, but the French don't actually write that out specifically in their document? And why do the French have that, but the Americans don't have something similar? Think about that broadly. And then we'll talk about it this Wednesday, as to why France went in one direction, America went in another, even though they started from the same pot of ideas. And then this Wednesday, I'll talk about the French Revolution and how, in a nutshell, the French Revolution was the American Revolution times crazy. The French Revolution was far more bloody, far more revolutionary, with a much, much, much larger body count and a much longer legacy in history. The French one. So with that, I'm going to let you go. 5 minutes early. I know it's not much, but it's something. I will see you this Wednesday. If you came in late, please let me know, etc., etc.